Imagine standing on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. It is July 28, 1932. In the distance, something unusual is moving toward you. Cavalry. American cavalry. Soldiers sit high above the street with sabers drawn. Behind them comes infantry wearing steel helmets and carrying rifles with fixed bayonets. And behind them, tanks. Gas masks are being handed out. Tear gas grenades are ready. Hundreds of United States Army troops are moving through the nation's capital, preparing to clear thousands of people from the streets. But this isn't an invading army. There has been no foreign attack, and the people facing those soldiers are not enemy troops. Many of them had worn the same uniform. 14 years earlier, they had been sent across the Atlantic to fight for the United States in the First World War. Now they were unemployed. Some were homeless. Many had brought their wives and children with them. And before the night was over, American troops would use cavalry charges, bayonets, and tear gas to drive them from Washington, while their largest camp went up in flames. So how does this happen? How does a country go from thanking its soldiers for saving democracy to sending the army against them? The answer begins with a promise and a date. 1945. When American soldiers returned from World War I, many discovered something uncomfortable. While they had been earning military wages, civilian workers at home had benefited from the wartime economy. A Senate investigation later concluded that enlisted servicemen had received significantly less than even lower-paid civilian laborers during the war. Veterans organizations began demanding compensation. Congress eventually responded. In 1924, lawmakers created what became known as the World War Adjusted Compensation Program. The idea was relatively simple. Veterans would receive credit based on their service. $1 for each day served inside the United States, and $1.25 for each day served overseas. But there was a catch. For most veterans, Washington wasn't handing them cash. It was handing them a certificate earning interest, a certificate that would eventually be worth around $1,000 on average, and a certificate that could not normally be redeemed until 1945. More than 3 million veterans eventually received certificates with a combined face value measured in billions of dollars. In the prosperity of the 1920s, waiting may have seemed possible. Then the economy collapsed. And suddenly, 1945 might as well have been another century. The stock market crashed in 1929. Banks failed. Businesses disappeared. Factories shut down. And millions of Americans lost their jobs. Among them were men who had survived artillery shells, machine gun fire, and disease in Europe, only to come home and discover that patriotism did not pay the rent. Their compensation certificates had value. But not now. Not when the mortgage was due. Not when children needed food. Not when there was no paycheck coming next week. Veterans began asking a very simple question. If Washington already acknowledged that this money belonged to us, why make us wait until 1945? Representative Wright Patman of Texas became one of the leading supporters of legislation that would allow veterans to redeem their certificates early. President Herbert Hoover opposed the idea. His concern was not imaginary. Immediate payment represented an enormous federal expense at precisely the moment government finances were already under extraordinary pressure. Veterans programs themselves were already consuming a substantial portion of federal spending. But politically, another problem was developing. Washington was finding ways to stabilize banks, railroads, and other major institutions, and desperate veterans could see it. The question was becoming bigger than the bonus. It was becoming, who does the government rescue when there isn't enough money to rescue everyone? And in Oregon, a former Army sergeant named Walter Waters decided veterans should ask that question in person. On May 10, 1932, a group of veterans gathered in Portland, Oregon. They were nearly 3,000 miles from Washington. Most had almost no money, so they improvised. They climbed aboard freight trains. They accepted food from sympathetic communities. Veterans working on the railroad sometimes looked the other way. When rail transport failed, states began providing trucks simply to move the growing group along. And as word spread, more veterans joined. What began as a relatively small expedition became a national movement. They borrowed a name from the force that had fought in Europe. The American Expeditionary Forces had gone overseas. This would be the Bonus Expeditionary Force, the BEF. The newspapers had another name for them, the Bonus Army. By late May, the first groups were reaching Washington, and then they did something Washington wasn't prepared for. They didn't leave. The veterans built camps. The largest emerged across the Anacostia River from central Washington. Scrap lumber became walls. Tin became roofs. Old automobiles, discarded materials, and whatever else could be found became shelter. Other veterans occupied abandoned buildings downtown. There were kitchens, rules, camp leaders, military-style organization, and families. Wives and children had come too. At one point, more than 11,600 veterans were living in encampments around Washington, with hundreds of family members alongside them. The camps also produced one of the more remarkable details of the entire story. Black veterans joined the movement as well, and the Bonus Army included racially integrated communities at a time when segregation remained deeply embedded across American life. This was not a perfect community. There were political radicals. There were arguments. Conditions were unsanitary. Officials worried about disease, but the majority of marchers were veterans, and for weeks the movement remained largely orderly. Army intelligence looked for evidence that communist organizers controlled the Bonus Army. It found radicals around the movement, but it did not substantiate the idea that communists were secretly commanding the protest as a whole. That distinction would soon become incredibly important, because one of America's most powerful generals was beginning to see the Bonus Army very differently. But first, Congress had to vote. Thousands of veterans crowded around Capitol Hill. Inside Congress, lawmakers faced an uncomfortable choice: pay the veterans now, or tell desperate men carrying government certificates to wait another 13 years. The House narrowly approved legislation for immediate redemption. Then the bill reached the Senate. And there, the argument changed. This wasn't only about gratitude. It was about money. Opponents warned that immediate payment would place an enormous new burden on the federal government. Supporters pointed to the assistance Washington had already made available to powerful corporations and financial institutions. One senator summarized the anger bluntly. Government support seemed available for railroads, banks, insurance companies, and major financial interests, while veterans were being told to wait. On June 17, thousands gathered outside the Capitol as the Senate debated for hours. Eventually, the vote came. 62 against, 18 in favor. The bill was dead. Now imagine the scene outside. Thousands of men had traveled across the country. Some had sold possessions. Some had ridden freight cars. Many had nowhere else to go. Their last major legislative hope had just disappeared. Washington braced for violence. Instead, the veterans began singing America. Then they peacefully dispersed from the Capitol grounds. But they didn't go home, and that created Washington's next problem. Congress was almost finished for the summer. Once Congress left, what exactly were thousands of veterans still doing in the Capitol? Congress adjourned on July 16th. The political battle, at least temporarily, was over. But thousands of Bonus Army members remained. To the veterans, leaving meant admitting defeat. To government officials, the camps were increasingly becoming a logistical, political, and public health problem. There was also a practical dispute. Some veterans were occupying partially demolished buildings in an area being cleared for federal construction. Authorities wanted those buildings emptied. Eviction notices followed, and on the morning of July 28th, police began clearing the area. At first, the evacuation proceeded. Then some veterans attempted to return. Arguments turned physical. Bricks were thrown. Police opened fire. 2 veterans were killed. This detail matters. The 2 veterans killed that day were shot during the police confrontation. Before the Army's main assault began, But once blood had been spilled, officials feared the situation might explode. The district government requested federal military assistance, and President Herbert Hoover agreed. That decision would follow him for the rest of his political career. But what happened next was more complicated than the simple story that Hoover personally ordered the Army to destroy the Bonus Army camp, because his instructions were narrower than what the Army eventually did. And the man who expanded the mission was Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He was already one of the country's most famous military officers, and he was deeply suspicious of revolutionary political movements. Europe had seen revolutions. Communism had taken power in Russia. Economic collapse was radicalizing politics around the world. Inside parts of the American military establishment, domestic unrest was increasingly viewed through that same lens. Army planners had contingency plans for major civil disturbances, and as the Bonus Army grew, military intelligence watched it. MacArthur increasingly believed the movement represented something more threatening than a group of veterans asking for money. But the evidence did not support the idea that the Bonus Army itself was fundamentally a communist revolutionary force. A later Veterans Administration survey found that roughly 94% of the Bonus Army members examined were Army or Navy veterans. President Hoover nevertheless faced a real problem on July 28th. Police had lost control of part of the situation. People had been shot. Federal property was involved. So Hoover authorized the Army to assist. But according to the Army's own historical review, Hoover did not declare martial law. He wanted police authority to remain primary. The Army was supposed to support the police, demonstrate overwhelming presence, and exercise restraint. Women and children were specifically to be treated carefully. MacArthur chose a much more aggressive interpretation, and at approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon, Washington saw what that interpretation looked like. Around 500 troops initially moved into position. More would follow. There was infantry from the 12th Infantry, mounted troops from the 3rd Cavalry, and 5 light tanks. Serving as an executive officer with the cavalry was a young major named George S. Patton, Jr. Standing near MacArthur was another officer, MacArthur's aide, Dwight D. Eisenhower. 2 men who would later become giants of World War II were now present during one of the strangest military operations in American history. Eisenhower reportedly advised MacArthur not to personally take command in the streets. MacArthur ignored him. The troops advanced. Infantry fixed bayonets. Cavalry drew sabers. Soldiers carried tear gas. The veterans and crowds were ordered to disperse. Then the gas came. People began running. Mounted cavalry pushed forward. When parts of the crowd reformed around the horsemen, Patton ordered several cavalry charges at relatively controlled speeds to break them apart. Infantry followed. Bayonets were used to prod people away. Tear gas drifted beyond the immediate confrontation and affected bystanders as well. Now consider the image. Some of the men being pushed down Pennsylvania Avenue had once survived German artillery. Some had American military decorations on their clothes, and now another generation of American soldiers was moving them at bayonet point. But technically, MacArthur had already achieved the immediate objective. The downtown camps had been cleared. The threat near the major federal buildings was disappearing. The Army could have stopped. President Hoover wanted it to stop. MacArthur did not. Across the Anacostia River sat the largest veterans camp. Camp marks. Thousands of veterans and family members were there. Unlike the downtown buildings, this camp presented no immediate threat to the White House or Capitol. It could have been isolated, and by evening, President Hoover sent instructions that the Army was not to continue the operation into the camp. MacArthur continued anyway. According to the U.S. Army's modern historical analysis, Hoover's order to halt reached the military chain more than once. MacArthur nevertheless allowed the operation to proceed across the river. This is where the story becomes more than a bad political decision. It becomes a civil-military story. MacArthur believed that once military operations had begun, commanders required broad freedom to complete the mission as they saw fit. To him, leaving the bonus army intact across the river meant leaving the operation unfinished. So infantry began crossing the bridge. Tear gas cleared resistance. The troops entered the camp. Veterans fled. Families grabbed whatever possessions they could carry. And fires appeared among the shacks. Some fires were started by soldiers. Some were reportedly started by veterans themselves. Eventually, much of the camp was burning. Behind the flames, the dome of the United States Capitol could still be seen. It was almost too perfect an image. The government on one side, the men who had fought for it on the other, and between them, smoke. The operation cleared the camp without Army gunfire producing a massacre. And that fact matters. This was not a battlefield in the conventional sense, but politically, it was devastating. Newspapers published photographs of burning shacks. Newsreels showed cavalry, bayonets, tear gas, veterans and their families fleeing. Whatever legal arguments existed, whatever sanitation problems officials had faced, whatever fears MacArthur held about radicalism, those complexities disappeared inside one unforgettable image: the American Army driving American veterans from the Capitol. And 1932 was an election year. Herbert Hoover was already one of the most unpopular presidents in modern American history because of the Great Depression. Now his opponents had something visual, something emotional, something impossible to explain with statistics. Hoover had authorized the Army's involvement. MacArthur had exceeded the restrained mission Hoover envisioned. But Hoover was the president, and presidents own what happens under their administration. The political damage was enormous. A few months later, Franklin D. Roosevelt crushed Hoover in the presidential election. But here's the twist. Roosevelt wasn't actually prepared to give the veterans everything they wanted either. It is tempting to tell this as a simple story. Hoover refused to pay the veterans. Roosevelt replaced Hoover. The veterans won. Except that isn't what happened. When another group of bonus marchers came to Washington in 1933, the Roosevelt administration treated them much more carefully. Veterans were offered organized facilities and transportation. Roosevelt also opened Civilian Conservation Corps opportunities to older veterans, but he still opposed immediate full payment of the bonus. In 1936, Congress finally passed legislation paying the certificates early. Roosevelt vetoed it. Congress overrode him. More than 3 million World War I veterans were processed for the payout, with approximately $1.9 billion ultimately distributed. So this was never simply a Republican versus Democrat story. The real argument was larger. How much did the government owe veterans? When should it pay them? Could Washington afford it during an economic catastrophe? And what happened when people who believed the government owed them something decided they would no longer wait quietly? 12 years after the bonus army was driven from Washington, the United States was fighting another world war. But this time, millions more Americans were in uniform, and Washington faced a familiar question. What happens when they come home? In 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, education, training, home loan support, unemployment assistance. Instead of asking millions of veterans to fight individually for compensation after returning home, the government created a broad system designed to help them transition back into civilian life. The bonus army was not the only reason the GI Bill existed, but congressional and Army historical accounts explicitly place the bitter veterans' politics of the interwar period among the experiences that shaped how America approached the next generation of returning servicemen. And that brings us back to Pennsylvania Avenue, July 28, 1932. The horses, the bayonets, the tanks, the tear gas, the men running from soldiers wearing the uniform they themselves had once worn. The most disturbing part of the bonus army story isn't that America suddenly stopped respecting veterans. Many of the policemen, officials, soldiers, and citizens involved were veterans themselves. Even Hoover had quietly authorized food, tents, and medical assistance for the marchers before the confrontation. The tragedy was more complicated. A government under enormous economic pressure saw a growing protest. Military leaders feared political revolution. Police lost control of a confrontation. 2 men were killed. The army entered, and a general who believed he was defending order pushed far beyond what was necessary to restore it. The result was an image America never forgot. Because nations are very good at celebrating soldiers when wars begin. Parades are easy. Medals are easy. Speeches are easy. The harder question comes years later. When the uniforms are gone, the war is old news. The economy is collapsing, and the people who were once called heroes arrive at the government's door asking it to keep its promises. In 1932, America answered them with soldiers, and that is why the bonus army wasn't merely a protest over money. It was a warning. A nation doesn't reveal what it thinks of its veterans when it sends them to war. It reveals it when they come home.